October 13th, 1940, 18:30 hours. Broadcasting House, London. Princess Elizabeth sat before the BBC microphone, 14 years old and visibly nervous, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Around her, studio walls bore fresh cracks from bombing raids 2 nights earlier. Through the windows, she could see smoke still rising from fires across London. The Luftwaffe's nightly work, the systematic attempt to break British civilian morale through terror. The producer gave the signal. The red light illuminated. Across Britain and throughout the Empire, millions of radios crackled to life. Elizabeth took a breath and began speaking in clear, measured tones that trembled slightly but never broke. In wishing you all good evening, I feel that I am speaking to friends and companions who have shared with my sister and myself many a happy children's hour. She paused, gathering composure, then continued. Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all. In a basement shelter in Stepney, 8-year-old Thomas Winters listened with his mother, both of them wrapped in blankets against the autumn cold. They'd been bombed out of their home 3 weeks earlier. His father was somewhere in North Africa with the 8th Army. Thomas hadn't seen him in 9 months and wasn't certain he'd recognize him if he returned. When the princess spoke about separation and loneliness, Thomas's mother squeezed his hand. "She understands," she whispered. "Even princesses understand." In Berlin, German intelligence officers monitoring BBC broadcasts sat forward with sudden attention. This wasn't Churchill's defiant rhetoric or military briefings. This was the king's daughter, 14 years old, broadcasting directly to British children while Luftwaffe bombers prepared for another night of raids. The propaganda value was immense, and they had no equivalent response: the Blitz. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign against British cities had been underway for 2 months, attempting to break civilian morale and force Britain to negotiate peace. The attacks were systematic and devastating. London suffered nightly raids, hundreds of bombers dropping high explosives and incendiaries, creating firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. Coventry was virtually destroyed in a single night. Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, every major industrial city faced sustained bombing designed to destroy both industrial capacity and civilian will to continue fighting. The casualties were severe and predominantly civilian. By October, over 13,000 British civilians had been killed, over 20,000 seriously injured. Entire families were wiped out when bombs struck shelters. Children were orphaned. Parents lost children. The psychological impact was profound. Constant fear, disrupted sleep, accumulated trauma from witnessing destruction and death. The government's response included massive child evacuation program. Operation Pied Piper had relocated over 1.5 million children from cities to countryside or overseas, to Canada, Australia, even the United States. The intention was protective, but the reality was traumatic. Children as young as 5 were separated from parents, sent to live with strangers, often unable to understand why their families had sent them away. The evacuees faced multiple traumas simultaneously. Separation from parents created profound anxiety. Many children believed they'd been abandoned or that their families had been killed. Adjustment to new environments was difficult. Urban children struggled with rural life. Cultural differences created friction with host families. Some evacuees faced neglect or abuse from hosts who resented the burden. The loneliness was crushing for children too young to understand the strategic necessity of their displacement. Morale among evacuated children became serious concern by autumn 1940. Letters home revealed depression, behavioral problems, requests to return to cities despite bombing. Some children ran away from host families, attempting to walk hundreds of miles back to London or other cities. The psychological toll threatened to create a generation of traumatized children whose wartime experiences would scar them permanently. The government recognized that maintaining evacuee morale required addressing their emotional needs beyond physical safety. Children needed reassurance that they mattered, that separation was temporary, that their sacrifices were recognized and valued. Traditional propaganda was insufficient. Official broadcasts felt distant and impersonal. What was needed was message that spoke directly to children's experiences from voice they could trust. The decision. The proposal came from several sources simultaneously. BBC Children's Hour producers, government officials concerned about evacuee morale, and Queen Elizabeth herself, who understood the symbolic power of royal family addressing civilian suffering directly. Princess Elizabeth had turned 14 in April 1940, old enough to understand the war's impact, but young enough to connect authentically with evacuated children. She'd experienced a modified version of evacuation herself, living at Windsor Castle rather than Buckingham Palace, separated from normal routines, adjusting to wartime restrictions. While her circumstances were vastly more privileged than typical evacuees, the emotional experience of displacement had parallels. The king initially hesitated. Broadcasting was a relatively new medium for royal family. His own struggles with stammer made him cautious about putting his daughter in a situation where speech difficulties might humiliate her. The precedent of young royal making political broadcast, and make no mistake, any broadcast during Blitz was inherently political, raised concerns about appropriate boundaries for adolescent princess. But Queen Elizabeth understood something crucial, that shared suffering created opportunities for monarchy to demonstrate relevance to ordinary people's lives. The royal family had already made strategic decision to remain in London despite bombing, to share civilian risks, to visit bombed neighborhoods and demonstrate solidarity with victims. A broadcast by Princess Elizabeth would extend that solidarity specifically to evacuated children who felt abandoned and forgotten. The decision was made. Elizabeth would broadcast on BBC Children's Hour, speaking directly to evacuees throughout empire. The message would be personal rather than political. One child speaking to others about shared experiences of separation and fear, offering comfort through authentic connection rather than abstract patriotism. The broadcast. The speech lasted 6 minutes, brief but precisely calibrated to maintain children's attention while delivering substantive message. Elizabeth began by acknowledging shared experiences. Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. The recognition was simple but powerful. Evacuees were seen, their sacrifices acknowledged by highest levels of British society. She continued with personal connection. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all. The admission of shared vulnerability was unprecedented for royal broadcast, princesses admitting to loneliness and fear, placing themselves alongside evacuees rather than above them. The message emphasized unity across empire. All of us children who are still at home think continually of our friends and relations who have gone overseas, who have traveled thousands of miles to find a wartime home and a kindly welcome in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United States of America. The geographical scope reminded evacuees they were part of global community, that their displacement served larger purpose. She addressed their contributions directly. We children at home are full of cheerfulness and courage. We are trying to do all we can to help our gallant sailors, soldiers, and airmen. And we are trying, too, to bear our own share of the danger and sadness of war. The acknowledgement that children were bearing danger and sadness validated their experiences while framing them as service equivalent to military contributions. The conclusion looked toward future. When peace comes, remember it will be for us, the children of today, to make the world of tomorrow a better and happier place. The appeal positioned evacuees not as victims, but as future leaders whose wartime sacrifices would give them moral authority to build better world. She closed simply. My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say goodnight to you. Come on, Margaret. Her younger sister added brief farewell, and the broadcast ended. The impact. The reaction was immediate, widespread, and emotionally overwhelming. Letters poured into Buckingham Palace from evacuees across Britain and Empire. Children wrote, describing how hearing the princess's voice made them feel less alone, how knowing even royals understood separation provided comfort, how the broadcast gave them renewed strength to endure displacement. Parents wrote thanking the princess for reaching their children when they couldn't. Teachers at evacuation centers reported improved morale and reduced behavioral problems in days following broadcast. The press coverage was extensive and uniformly positive. British newspapers called it Voice of Young Britain and Princess Speaks to Empire's Children. American press coverage was particularly significant. United States remained neutral in October 1940, and anything demonstrating British resilience helped shift American public opinion towards supporting Britain. The symbolic power transcended the words themselves. A 14-year-old princess broadcasting during Blitz demonstrated multiple truths simultaneously: that royal family shared civilian dangers, that British morale remained intact despite bombing, that Britain was fighting for future represented by its children, that civilization and compassion survived even in total war. The broadcast became one of most replayed recordings in BBC history. It was distributed to schools, played at evacuation centers, broadcast repeatedly throughout Empire. For many evacuees, it became touchstone, concrete evidence that their suffering mattered to someone beyond their immediate circle, that they were part of something larger than their individual loneliness. The German response. German intelligence and propaganda ministries struggled to respond effectively to broadcasts that undermined several core assumptions about British collapse. Nazi propaganda had consistently portrayed Britain as decadent democracy where privileged classes abandoned common people to suffer while elite fled to safety. The princess's broadcast contradicted this narrative completely. Here was ultimate symbol of British privilege, voluntarily sharing civilian dangers and addressing common children's suffering directly. German intelligence reports noted the broadcast with mixture of frustration and professional respect. One analysis preserved in archives acknowledged, British morale management continues to exceed expectations. Royal families' calculated sharing of civilian risks creates emotional connection our propaganda cannot effectively counter. Princess Elizabeth's broadcast demonstrates sophistication in addressing evacuation programs' psychological costs. The Luftwaffe High Command received reports about broadcasts' impact on British morale with growing concern. The bombing campaign was predicated on assumption that sustained civilian casualties would create pressure for negotiated peace. But if British civilians, including children, were maintaining morale and framing their suffering as patriotic service, then bombing was failing to achieve strategic objectives. Some German officers privately expressed uncomfortable admiration for British approach. One Luftwaffe officer's diary entry from October 1940 stated, "They have 14-year-old princess broadcasting during our raids, speaking calmly about shared sacrifice. Meanwhile, our leadership hides in bunkers and issues propaganda that sounds hollow. The British understand something we don't about leading people through crisis." Hitler himself reportedly received briefing about broadcast and dismissed it as sentimental weakness. But his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, noted in diary that Germany had no equivalent symbolic resource. German princesses and nobility were either politically compromised by association with Nazis or had fled. The contrast with British royal family's visible solidarity with population was stark and strategically disadvantageous. The continuing role. Elizabeth's broadcast was not isolated incident, but beginning of more active public role during war. She continued making occasional broadcasts, each carefully crafted to address specific morale needs. She visited hospitals, treating wounded servicemen, evacuation centers housing displaced children, factories where women worked producing munitions and aircraft. Her presence was always understated. No grand speeches or dramatic gestures, just quiet acknowledgement of others' service and sacrifice. At 18, she joined Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service, training as driver and mechanic. The service was genuine. She qualified through standard training, performed actual maintenance work, lived in barracks with other ATS members. The symbolism was powerful. Heir to throne performing manual labor in military uniform while war continued. The cumulative effect of these actions was profound. British monarchy had been criticized before war as outdated institution disconnected from modern life. The war years transformed public perception through royal family's visible sharing of civilian dangers and Elizabeth's personal service. By war's end, monarchy's relevance to ordinary people's lives had been demonstrated conclusively. The evacuees' memory. For children who heard broadcast while living as evacuees, the memory remained vivid for their entire lives. Thomas Winters, the 8-year-old who'd listened in Stepney shelter with his mother, later recalled, "I was scared and lonely and missed my father terribly. When Princess Elizabeth said she understood what it meant to be away from people you love, I believed her. Not because she was princess, but because her voice sounded like she actually understood. That broadcast didn't end the war or bring my father home, but it made me feel less alone. That mattered more than I can explain." Similar testimonies emerged from thousands of former evacuees. The broadcast hadn't solved their problems. They remained separated from families, living in difficult circumstances, facing uncertain futures. But knowing that highest levels of British society acknowledged their suffering and valued their sacrifice, provided psychological sustenance that helped them endure. Many former evacuees cited broadcast as formative experience that shaped their relationship with monarchy. They'd heard authentic compassion from young princess during their worst period, and that memory created lasting bond. When Elizabeth became queen in 1952, many former evacuees felt personal connection. She'd spoken to them during war, acknowledged their suffering, and they'd watched her grow from 14-year-old broadcaster to monarch. The strategic success. The broadcast represented successful execution of morale management during total war. British government faced genuine crisis with evacuated children. Their psychological deterioration threatened to undermine entire evacuation program, potentially forcing return of children to bombed cities where casualties would be catastrophic. The program's success required maintaining evacuee morale while separation continued. Traditional propaganda was insufficient because it lacked emotional authenticity. Official broadcasts about duty and sacrifice sounded hollow to children who were homesick and frightened. What was needed was voice they could trust, speaking directly to their emotional experiences. Elizabeth's broadcast provided that voice. It succeeded because it was authentic. A young person acknowledging difficult emotions rather than adult authority figure demanding stoic endurance. The emotional honesty created connection that enabled evacuees to frame their suffering as meaningful service rather than pointless abandonment. The strategic impact extended beyond immediate morale improvement. The broadcast became symbol of British resilience that influenced neutral nations' perceptions, particularly United States, where public opinion was gradually shifting towards supporting Britain. American media coverage emphasized young princess broadcasting during bombing raids, creating image of Britain as civilization worth defending against barbarism. The Evening Radio. London, October 13th, 1940. 1836 hours. The broadcast concluded. Elizabeth sat back from the microphone, exhausted from nervous tension and emotional weight of addressing millions of listeners. Through the windows, she could see searchlights beginning to sweep the sky, the nightly preparation for German bombers that would arrive within hours. The producer gave thumbs up. "Excellent, Your Royal Highness. That was exactly what was needed." Elizabeth nodded, but felt uncertain whether her words had been adequate. She'd tried to express comfort and solidarity, but could 6 minutes of broadcast really matter to children facing loneliness and fear across the empire? Could her privileged voice authentically connect with evacuees living in circumstances she could barely imagine? She wouldn't know the answer for weeks, not until letters began arriving from evacuees describing how the broadcast had helped them, how hearing her voice had made them feel less alone, how knowing even princesses understood separation had given them strength to continue. But in that moment, sitting in damaged BBC building while air raid sirens began their nightly warning, she'd done what was asked of her. She'd spoken honestly about difficult emotions. She'd acknowledged that children's suffering mattered. She'd tried to comfort those who needed comfort. The bombers would come that night, as they had for months and would for months more. They would drop thousands of tons of explosives, kill hundreds, destroy buildings and infrastructure, attempt to break British morale through sustained terror. But they couldn't silence the broadcast that had already reached millions. They couldn't erase the memory of young princess speaking calmly during Blitz, acknowledging evacuees' suffering, demonstrating that British civilization included compassion even under sustained attack. German bombers tried to break Britain through terror. A 14-year-old princess responded with 6 minutes of authentic compassion that strengthened civilian morale and demonstrated what Britain was fighting for more effectively than any military briefing could express. The words had been simple. The impact was profound. And decades later, when former evacuees recalled the war's darkest moments, many would remember not just the bombing and separation and fear, but also the evening when Princess's voice came through their radios, acknowledging their suffering, telling them they mattered, proving that even in total war, humanity and compassion could survive. The broadcast ended. The sirens wailed. The bombers came. But the voice remained, recorded, replayed, remembered. Testament to Britain's understanding that winning war required not just defeating enemies, but maintaining civilization worth defending. A 14-year-old had demonstrated that truth more effectively than any adult authority could have, speaking honestly about fear and loneliness while bombs fell around her, proving that strength included vulnerability and that leadership required authentic connection to those being led. The German High Command would never understand this. They saw compassion as weakness, emotion as liability, human connection as sentimentality that undermined military efficiency. Britain saw them as sources of strength, the foundations of civilization that made victory meaningful rather than merely tactical. Princess Elizabeth's 6-minute broadcast proved which understanding was correct. The words she spoke that evening, simple, honest, emotionally authentic, did more to sustain British morale than thousands of tons of German bombs did to destroy it. That was lesson the Luftwaffe learned too late, that you cannot break a people who believe their suffering has meaning, who feel connected to leadership that acknowledges their humanity, who understand they're fighting for civilization that values compassion even in the darkest hours. The broadcast was brief, the memory was eternal, and the princess who spoke those words would carry them throughout her life. Her first lesson in leadership, her first understanding that authentic service meant sharing others' burdens rather than standing apart. Her first recognition that even royalty could and should acknowledge vulnerability and fear because doing so strengthened rather than weakened those who listened.